Amen. So you're there in 1 Kings chapter 11, and we are continuing our study through the Kings. So this is where we get the split. So we already did King Saul. He was the first king that God had anointed over all of Israel, and then King David obviously took his place, and then his King David's son Solomon. And so it's just the easy way to remember this. Saul reigned for 40 years, David reigned for 40 years, and Solomon reigned for 40 years. And they are the kings that reigned over all of Israel. So that's all 12 tribes. And now we're going to get into the fact that there's going to be a split, and how now there's going to be this northern kingdom, as far as there's going to be most of the tribes are up there. And then you have the southern kingdom, which is primarily Judah. But there's also you have Benjamin that's in there a little bit too, and then you have the Levites. You know, obviously they don't have any lot of inheritance, but they're pretty much down there. And then we're going to see other tribes kind of trickle down into Judah. So what we're going to see from here on out is you're going to see the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Okay, and so this split. So you're going to have these two different lines of kings. And so what I plan on doing is going for the kingdom of the northern kingdom of Israel, as far as going through all those kings first, and then coming back and going through the kings of Judah. The kings of Judah, honestly, are the ones that we care about. Meaning like that's the line of Christ. That's the line that actually does right every once in a while. Okay, so when you go through the kings of Israel, it's just bad. It's just bad. Through that whole line. And so, except for Jehu. But then he ends up not being that great in the end anyway. But so anyway, we're going to be going through that. And there may be some kings that I'm going to basically clump together. Because some of the kings, they reign for like a month and then they burn the house down over top of them. You know what I mean? So like we're going to kind of clump some of them together, just because I don't want to preach a whole sermon on burning the house down. I guess I could preach a whole sermon on that. But I do want to keep it more so of like the details of the kings and all that stuff that's going on. But go to 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 11 there. We see that Solomon, the kingdom is taking, the kingdom is being rent from him, but not from him in his days, meaning that it's going to be his son that has to deal with it. So in his days, he's reigning over all of Israel, and it's not being rent from him at that time. So in verse 11 there it says, "Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, For as much as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant, and my statutes which I commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant." And so what happened? Well, he was making high places and burning incense and like doing all these things to these false gods. Okay, so he was worshiping idols and like basically making all these places and groves for his strange wives, meaning that they were unbelieving wives. And he took 700 wives and 300 concubines. Or 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. So he had 1,000 wives. 1,000. And so obviously they drew his heart away from God, and to where he was doing all this other stuff. Now I still believe Solomon was saved. Okay, I don't believe that this means he wasn't saved, but he obviously was dabbling into things that he shouldn't have been in. And this is basically God's breaking point with Solomon, saying, all right, that's enough. He obviously there's other things that you could say, well, Solomon didn't do this, he didn't do this and that, but this was the breaking point, is idolatry to the T. Now, that servant that he's going to give it to is Jeroboam, okay? And so Jeroboam's who we're talking about, or who I'm preaching on tonight, and what we'll see is that Jeroboam actually starts out to be a friend of Solomon. He's a servant of Solomon, and you may not have known that. You just kind of think of Jeroboam, and I named the king Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Okay, and if anybody's ever read through 1st and 2nd Kings, that name is brought up over and over and over and over again. They did after the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He's going to destroy him because of the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, son of Nebat, son of Nebat. Like it's just going over and over and over again. And so what he does, when he is reigning over Israel, is something that is just basically this plague on that northern kingdom. It actually trickles down onto the kings of Judah too. And so there's a lot to be said about what he does here. But in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 26, we see Jeroboam here. And I just want you to see who he is. So 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 26 says, Jeroboam the son of Nebat, an Ephrathite of Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the king. So this is the first mention we see of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now, the reason that I say Jeroboam the son of Nebat, first of all, so that you know this is the one that the kings keep bringing up, and throughout the Kings and Chronicles as far as the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. We'll see what that sin is. But there's going to be another Jeroboam at the very end of the line of the kings of northern Israel. So that's going to be the hardest thing to deal with, is when you have a repeat of a king. And honestly, I believe that's the only one that's repeated in the lines, meaning that what you're going to see is that there's going to be a Joash that's the king of Israel and a Joash that's the king of Judah, right? And so you're going to see these that are repeated, but one's Judah, one's Israel. So it's kind of not that bad to keep track of. But there's two Jeroboams in the northern kingdom. But one starts the thing, and one's pretty much at the end of it. Okay, so you're going to have Jeroboam the second, if you want to call him that. But what we see here is that he's an Ephrathite. What's an Ephrathite? Ephraim. So who's Ephraim was one of the sons of Joseph, and Ephraim is actually the biggest tribe in the northern kingdom. Okay, so if you want to see, if you saw a map, you think of the 12 tribes, it's not equal as far as the amount of people that are in it. Judah is huge. Judah is one of the biggest tribes, and Ephraim is massive too. If you remember Ephraim, when they were taking over the land, they said, this isn't enough room for us. You know, we're a big tribe. There's not enough room. And he said, take that mountain over there if you're strong enough. And so Ephraim is a very big tribe. And Ephraim is also where Joshua the son of Nun was from. That's the tribe that he was from. But it's interesting that he's from the tribe of Ephraim, because he ends up taking over that northern kingdom. And throughout the Bible, as far as the prophets, especially the minor prophets, you're going to see this where he's talking about Judah and then he's talking about Ephraim. And Ephraim is basically meaning the northern kingdom. Okay, so sometimes you'll see that it'll be saying, instead of just saying Israel, it'll say Ephraim, and then it'll just say Judah. So, but Judah is comprised of more than just Judah, meaning that southern kingdom of Judah, and Ephraim is comprised of more than Ephraim, meaning that a lot of times it'll just say Israel as a catch-all for that northern kingdom, but sometimes it'll just say Ephraim. And so, anyway, just something to think about when you're reading through that and you see Ephraim, you're like, why is Ephraim being pointed out here? It's because it's talking about that northern kingdom, okay? And going on there in verse 27, I just want you to see that he's a servant. And what it's saying here is that he's lifting up his hand against the king. So the way this reads is it's kind of basically already hitting at the fact that Jeroboam and Solomon are adversaries. But really what I want you to see, first of all, is that how did it start? Where did Jeroboam come from? Well, he was a servant to the king, king of Israel, Solomon. Okay, so in verse 27 it says, and this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king. It says, Solomon built Millo and repaired the breaches of the city of David, his father, and the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and Solomon, seeing the young man that he was industrious, he made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph. It makes sense that he'd be over the charge of the house of Joseph. He's of Ephraim. But notice that he saw that Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and he was industrious, and he set him over charge over that whole house of Joseph. So he was already in a position of power by Solomon. So this obviously happened earlier in Solomon's reign. So this wasn't at the tail end here where this story is taking place. So it's kind of taking you back in time saying, hey, by the way, Jeroboam was a servant of Solomon, and he's one, because in this chapter, God is showing us, hey, there's a lot of adversaries now that Solomon did this great sin of this idolatry that he's bringing against him. And even one of Solomon's own servants he's going to basically be an adversary. And Jeroboam's going to be that servant that he gives that kingdom to. So in verse 11 it says, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee and will give it to thy servant. Jeroboam's that servant. And go to verse 29 there of 1 Kings chapter 11. We see that this is the reason why Jeroboam lifted up his hand against the king, because Solomon was trying to kill him. Okay, but why did he? Why was this adversary? Why was this this fight between the two? Is because of this prophecy that Ahijah the prophet gives. And verse 29 it says, and it came to pass, at that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him in the way, and he had clad himself with a new garment, and they two were alone in the field. And Ahijah caught the new garment that was on him and rent it in 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, "Take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee. But he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because that they have forsaken me and have worshipped Ashtaroth, the gods of the Zidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways, to do that which is right in mine eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as did David his father. Howbeit, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life for David my servant's sake, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and will give it unto thee, even 10 tribes. And unto his son will I give 1 tribe, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen me to put my name there. And I will take thee, and thou shalt reign according to all that thy soul desireth, and shalt be king over Israel." So this is the prophecy basically saying, Jeroboam, I'm giving you 10 tribes. It's being rent from Solomon. I'm not going to take it from him directly, meaning that he's going to die, and that's when you're going to get the 10 tribes. Now, when you read this, you ever wondered, why is it 10 and not 11? Right? There's 12 tribes. So there's 2 ways to look at this. Maybe it's talking about maybe Levi's left out because Levi doesn't have an inheritance, right? But I more so lean towards that it's because you say, well, what would be 11 if Levi is not part of that? Well, Manasseh and Ephraim were split from Joseph. So Joseph was split into 2 tribes. So when it says the 12 tribes, a lot of times it's talking about, Ephraim, Manasseh, and all the rest of the tribes and not counting Levi. Okay, because Levi was just basically dispersed throughout all those. They didn't have any inheritance. And the reason that I more so lean to the fact that it's not talking about Levi, but it's actually talking about Benjamin is not one of those. And, in this chapter, it more so leans on Judah as the only tribe that he's getting. But he keeps bringing up Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in Benjamin. Now, I don't have time to go to this, okay, but if you look at the lay of the land, Benjamin is basically north of Judah and their inheritance, and it's basically on the border of Benjamin is where you had Jerusalem, which is the city of David. Okay, so Benjamin basically was encompassed, and there's another verse in the Bible later on that talks about how Benjamin and Judah were the tribes that followed Rehoboam and followed that northern kingdom. So when it says 10, I believe it's basically just leaving out Benjamin and also talking about how Judah is the main tribe, because Benjamin was a really small tribe. Okay, so it's kind of a really small tribe that was basically pretty much just attached to Judah. Okay, and so don't get super caught up on that, but I think that I think it's Benjamin and Judah are the 2 tribes that Jeroboam's not getting, and Levi is not really mentioned because Levi doesn't have an inheritance. Okay, Levi has cities in all those places. Okay, so if it was to separate Levi, and he's not getting Levi, then they all have to move out of those tribes in the northern kingdom, and they have to come down to Judah. And so, but in both those cases, like I said, Ephraim is called Ephraim in the northern kingdom, it's called Judah in the southern kingdom, because those are the major tribe. That's the major tribe. That's who had the most of the population is Judah down in the southern kingdom. Most of the population is Ephraim in the northern kingdom. And so you say, I'm confused. Well, like I said, it could be either way. It could be saying, well, you get 10 tribes, and then Rehoboam's going to get 1 tribe, and Levi is the one that's not mentioned because it's not an inheritance, so they're just not going to mention Levi. But I more so think it's talking about he's going to get Manasseh, he's going to get Ephraim, and he's going to get all the other ones except for Benjamin and Judah. And Levi is just not mentioned because Levi is basically dispersed throughout all the land. So, but God, what's interesting about Jeroboam because he is a byword and a proverb, okay? If you've ever read through the Kings, you don't want to be Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. But notice in verse 38, God is promising to him prosperity if he just keep his commandments. That's very interesting, because David obviously is the one that he picked. That's who Christ is going to come through. That also shows you why he didn't just completely take it away from David, meaning that he did leave a remnant for Solomon's son. Because why? Because there has to be a remnant, because the kingly line goes down to Christ. It goes down to Jesus Christ, and of the seed of David, he's going to be the son of David. Okay. And we'll see that line is actually the only one that even lasts a little long, that actually does righteousness every once in a while, okay? So we'll see the southern kingdom is really where you're going to find anybody that's actually doing right half the time. And that northern kingdom just pretty much is apostate. So, but in verse 38, it says this, and it says, and it shall be, if thou wilt hearken unto all that I command thee, and wilt walk in my ways, and do that is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, that I will be with thee and build thee a sure house, as I built for David, and will give Israel unto thee. And I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. So it's interesting that he's basically saying, I will make you like David if you just follow me. So Jeroboam is not like he's getting, he was set up to fail. No, he was giving a blessing here, saying, hey, I'm judging the house of David because of Solomon, and I'm rending the kingdom, and I'm rending it in two, right? But, listen, if you just follow me, I'll bless you just like David. And you'll be a prosperous nation, and I'll give you the sure, think about that, a sure house that he's going to promise that to Jeroboam. So it's not like he's just basically saying, Jeroboam, you're going to take this and you're going to be evil and, nuts to that. No, he wanted Jeroboam to succeed, and he's saying, listen, all you have to do is just obey what I command you, do what I tell you to do, and I will bless you. But obviously he doesn't do that. We know the end of the story, but again, like I said, why did Jeroboam lift up his hand against the king? Well, it's because Solomon was trying to kill him. Okay, so looking at verse 27, what we see here is that in verse 27, and then we get where he lifts up his hand against the king, and then it's giving the reason why, but it's not until 40 until we see really the reason. Okay, we just see that whole prophecy of how the kingdom is going to be rent, given to Jeroboam. Verse 27, it says, and this was the cause that he lifted up his hand against the king. But really in verse 40 is where we see that cause. Solomon sought, therefore, to kill Jeroboam. Okay, so why did Jeroboam lift up his hand against the king? Because Solomon's trying to kill him because he heard this prophecy, right? Solomon heard the prophecy of Ahijah saying that this kingdom is going to be rent and given to thy servant, Jeroboam, and he's trying to kill him. He's trying to basically undo what God is saying he's going to do. So obviously we know how that works out. So obviously, if God said it's going to happen, good luck fighting against God and actually trying to change that. But he flees to Egypt. So it says in verse 40 there, it says, and Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt unto Shishak, the king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. And so he waits until the death of Solomon until he comes back on the scene. And that goes into the fact, too, that the kingdom's not rent until after Solomon dies. But it's interesting with all these adversaries, and I'm not really getting into all that, but these adversaries were like in Egypt. The one, Hadad, he marries Tarpanes, the Pharaoh's wife's sister. I can't remember if that's exactly right, but basically he ends up being like the king of Syria. Like Syria literally comes up out of all that Solomon did. You think about the repercussions of Solomon's sin with this, that you end up getting this nation of Syria that comes out of this and ends up afflicting Israel after this. You get Syria, then you get Assyria, who ultimately takes out the northern kingdom of Israel. And it kind of all goes back to this sin of Solomon that stirred up these adversaries, right? And it came back to all these adversaries were something that David did, right? David did some things to the Edomites, did some things over here, and Joab did this. But it wasn't until Solomon sinned that God basically stirred these guys up to be adversaries against Israel, and it was ultimately their undoing. And they ended up taking out that northern kingdom. But Jeroboam comes out of hiding. So in chapter 12, so 1 Kings chapter 12, so I hope you get what I'm saying here. So Solomon sins, idolatry, right? Ahijah the prophet comes to Jeroboam and says, it goes to Solomon and then to Jeroboam, saying, listen, I'm rending the kingdom from Solomon. I'm giving you 10 tribes. And then God is saying to him, hey, listen, just follow me, keep my commandments, and you'll have a sure house, and everything will be fine, and you'll rule well. But then he flees into Egypt because Solomon's trying to kill him because of that. And now we get to where he's coming back out after Solomon dies. So in verse 1 there, we see Rehoboam, which I'll do a whole sermon on Rehoboam, don't worry. It says in verse 1, it says, and Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king. And it came to pass when Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who was yet in Egypt, heard of it, for he was fled from the presence of King Solomon, and Jeroboam dwelt in Egypt, that they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the congregation of Israel came and spake unto Rehoboam, saying, thy father made our yoke grievous. Now therefore make thou the grievous service of thy father, and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighter, and we will serve thee. So, again, when I get into the sermon about Rehoboam, we're going to get into that whole story about how he sought the counsel of the young men and all that stuff. But really, what do we see? We see Jeroboam's the leader of this whole revolt against him being king. Because honestly, they could have just made him king, right? But there's this revolt basically saying, listen, we have something to say to you. Before you're made king, we need this to be lighter. We need the burden on us to be lighter than it was before, okay? And basically, it's an ultimatum. They're giving him an ultimatum, and it was of the Lord, obviously, that this would happen and that Rehoboam wouldn't get the full kingdom. But Jeroboam, notice, is in verse 3, is heading that up. Jeroboam comes up and heads that division up, that rebellion. And notice in verse 15 it says, wherefore the king hearkened not unto the people. So basically they give this ultimatum, and ultimately he says no. Okay, and we'll get into that whole story eventually with Rehoboam, but he denies it, and it says, and for the cause was from the Lord, that he might perform his saying which the Lord spake by Ahijah the Shilonite unto Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So when all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them, the people answered the king, saying, what portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to thine own house, David. So Israel departed unto their tents. Notice verse 19. So Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. And it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam was come again, that they sent and called him unto the congregation and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. Okay? And that's where you get that one tribe. But again, I believe that the tribe of Judah would be encompassing Benjamin. Okay? And so that's my, you'll see that later on. That's why I'm saying that. And that's why it's 10-1 instead of 11-1. Because I believe Benjamin is a part of Judah. And so, but anyway, we see that they make him king. And there's this whole thing, this whole back and forth between, not back and forth, but Rehoboam's trying to take back the kingdom. And God comes in and basically stops him from doing that. And says, listen, this is the way it needs to be. And, just deal with it. And they stop their fighting and all that as far as Rehoboam trying to retake over that kingdom and get all his people and all that. So, but Jeroboam is going to end up becoming a proverb. So he gets that kingdom, he gets that northern kingdom just like God said he would, those 10 tribes. But I want to read Ezekiel, go to Ezekiel chapter 14, because like I said, when you're going through the rest of these kings, as we go through here, what we're going to see is that if a king does bad, if he does evil in the sight of the Lord, a lot of times Jeroboam the son of Nebat is brought up. Now if a king does good, who's brought up? David. They did like David their father. So David is a good proverb, right? He's someone you want to be, associated with. And so what we'll see is that did bad, Jeroboam. Did good, David. So Jeroboam, what he ends up doing with the sin that he makes Israel to sin is so bad that he's mentioned every single time someone does evil. But it also shows you that his sin trickled down to all these generations to where they all did it too. So what you do will affect your children, whether good or bad. And it can affect to the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth generation, all the way down to where they keep doing it. And think about this. You know, we ran into a bunch of Catholics out soul winning today. How much does where you go to church affect your children when they say, why, you know, we ran into a lady, remember, she was like, her mom was like 90-some years old, and she's like, well, she's been Catholic her whole life. You know, she's going to die Catholic, and so am I. You know, well, what is that? That's family tradition. You know, well, I was Catholic, my parents were Catholic, they were Catholic, they were Catholic. Well, they're all going to hell. And that's all based off of someone that wanted to be Catholic back in the day and made that bad choice and didn't get saved. But listen, you can break that chain. But let's say you're in the chain where you're saying, well, I believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and my children are going to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. Listen, that'll bless your family down the line. And then they'll be getting saved, and they'll get saved, and they'll get saved. I'd rather have that line. So you don't want to be the bad line. You want to be the good line. And what you do as fathers and mothers and parents to your children can affect way more generations than just that one. You know, think about what your effect on your grandchildren and what that'll do, and then what they do with their children. And so, you know, this is a great way to understand how much that trickles down. Because sometimes you just think, well, it'll affect my children, then it'll be over, and it doesn't really matter what I do. No, it affects a lot. And, you know, we need to be thinking about that as parents especially. Now, I had you going to where? I lost my train of thought here. Ezekiel, thank you. Ezekiel chapter 14 and verse 7. It says, for every one of the house of Israel, or of the stranger that sojourneth in Israel, which separateth himself from me, and setteth up his idols in his heart, and putteth the stumbling block of his iniquity before his face, and cometh to a prophet to inquire of him concerning me, I, the Lord, will answer him by myself. And I will set my face against that man, and I will make him a sign and a proverb, and I will cut him off from the midst of my people, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. So what's he saying? He's basically saying, if you bring these idols and you put this stumbling block for other people to bow down to these idols and worship these idols, he's like, I'm going to answer you myself. I'm going to make you a proverb, a sign and a proverb. And that's what he does with Jeroboam. And why? Well, let's look at the sin that he did. Go to chapter 12, so 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 25. Because you're going to see this. As we go through all these kings, you're going to see the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. The sin of Jeroboam. They followed the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. What is that? Okay? So you really need to get this down of what that sin is, because you're going to keep seeing that over and over again. But it's not going to tell you every single time what that sin is. This is what it's pointing back to, is this sin right here. In verse 25, it says, and Jeroboam built Shechem and Mount Ephraim and dwelt therein, and went out from thence and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David, if this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. Then shall the heart of the people turn again unto their Lord, even unto unto Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they shall kill me, and go again to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Now, what's going on here? He's basically saying, okay, well, Jerusalem's in that southern kingdom, and in order to follow the Lord, you have to go to the temple. You have to go to where they're doing, the feasts and all that stuff. And what his thinking is, remember, he's saying this in his heart. He's saying, well, if they go down to do sacrifices at Jerusalem, then they're going to be like, why are we separate? And they're going to basically be thinking in their minds, like, we need to be a part of this kingdom. And they're going to be and they're just going to yoke up with Rehoboam, and then they're going to kill Jeroboam and say, well, let's get rid of this guy. We should have been with him to begin with, because he's got, the temple, and this is where the Levites are at doing the service, and he's afraid. He's afraid that this is going to happen. And so what's he do? He tries to make an alternative as far as how to worship God. And in verse 28, here's your sin. Here's the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And verse 28, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, is it too much for you to go up to Jerusalem? It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Wow. Now what we're going to see, and I'm going to show you, we're going to go to Exodus chapter 32. It's like reading Exodus chapter 32. Like the same exact phrase that's being said here is what they said in the wilderness. He's saying that these 2 golden calves, what is it with golden calves? I'm just being blunt with you. I don't get it. I don't get why the golden calf is such a, that's what we want to worship. Why? Is it because the cherubims have the face of a calf? I don't get it. I don't understand why that's the case, that they're just constantly wanting to worship a calf. Is this the seeds of Hinduism? Like with the cows, the sacred cows? Is this where they get that from? Was there some kind of just cow worship that was going on back then? I don't know. I'm just kind of venting about that because I don't really understand it. They're just yes, the golden calf, of course. That's who brought us out of Egypt. I don't get why they're just yeah, that's what we need to worship there. Anyway, so going on, they put it in 2 places. There's 2 golden calves, and they put it in 2 different places. One is in Bethel. So in verse 29, it says, he set the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. Now, Bethel, if you remember, is where it was called the house of God. This is where you had Jacob's ladder. That's not mentioned in the Bible, but there was this ladder, right, that Jacob had a dream, and he saw angels ascending and descending upon it. And he said, this is the gate to heaven. This is the house of God. Therefore, he called it Bethel. So you think of Beth means house, El means God. You think of Bethlehem, the house of bread. You think of just different things that Beth, is used for. But it's house of God, okay? That's the Bible plainly says that that's what that's from. So this golden calf is set up in that place where Jacob made a covenant with God, and he saw this vision and all this stuff. So Bethel is a significant place. Dan is kind of like the northern piece of that kingdom. So Dan's from Dan to Beersheba. If you want to remember where Dan is at, every time it would give basically from coast to coast. We'd say from coast to coast, right? But a lot of times in the Bible it'll say, from Dan even to Beersheba. And Beersheba is the northern portion, okay? So you have Sheba and Beersheba, that's the northern portion of Israel. The southern portion of Israel, and then Dan is the northern portion of Israel. Okay, so basically, he put it on the northern tip, and then Bethel was down kind of more on the southern portion of that northern kingdom. So he's basically saying he's getting them 2 locations. If you can't make it to Bethel, go to Dan. If you can't go to Dan, go to Bethel. But it says in verse 30 there, it says, and this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one even unto Dan. And he made a house of high places, and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. So not only are they not of the sons of Levi, they're the lowest people. Right? You just made these derelicts, a bunch of priests. Okay? And then it says in verse 32, it says, and Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah. And he offered upon the altar, so did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. So he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained the feast unto the children of Israel. And he offered upon the altar and burnt incense. So the 8th month of the 15th day, you know what that is? The Feast of Tabernacles. And so he basically took, this feast, instead of going to the Feast of Tabernacles, listen, come sacrifice unto this golden calf in Bethel. And so they would pretty much go to Dan most of the time, but then in Bethel they'd have on the 8th month, 15th day, they'd have this feast where they're just sacrificing and doing all this stuff to this golden calf. Now go to Exodus chapter 32 because I want you to see how similar this statement is. It's just baffling to me that they literally don't see this. You know what? I still get baffled today when people say things that are so unbiblical and they think it's biblical. Right? They'll say something like, well, didn't Jesus say this? Or doesn't the Bible say that? No, it's completely opposite, you big dumb animal. Now, I'm sorry I'm being a little crass, but that is the case sometimes where people say stuff that's so opposite of the Bible, it's like, you need to stop talking. And this is like, how do you not know what you just said? Is like why God was almost going to destroy every single person. If it wasn't for Moses, he would have destroyed every single person of Israel because of this sin. And they literally are verbatim just vomiting out what they said back in the wilderness. You know what that tells me? They didn't read the Bible. These people were not reading the law. They didn't know the Bible. And that, listen, there's nothing new under the sun because that happens today where people are just constantly spouting off what they think is right, what they think is true, and they end up saying the exact opposite of what the Bible says. Right. So, I'm baffled at it when I read it, but I'm like, you know what? It happens today. It still happens today. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a church that said, listen, let's set up these golden calves and worship God with them. Isn't that who brought them out of the land of Egypt? And they would be serious about it. And it'd be like, is that against the Bible? So in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 4, it says, and he received them out at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool. So it's talking about Aaron receiving their earrings. After he had made it a molten calf. And they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Did you catch that? That's exactly, I'm reading Exodus 32, by the way. You may have thought that I was just reading what Jeroboam said. I'm reading Exodus 32. You could look at what Jeroboam says in verse 28. It says, behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And they said in the wilderness, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. I mean, verbatim. Exactly what they said in the wilderness. And going on from there in Exodus 32, it says, and when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Is Jeroboam getting this from, is he literally pulling this out of here? It makes me wonder that he was in Exodus 32 and says, what can I do to get them away from serving God in Jerusalem? I'm going to actually do what they did in the wilderness. Because doesn't he make a feast to these calves? It says in verse 6, it says, and they rose up early on the morrow and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. I mean, it's just baffling to me when you see this. So this is the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. This is why they end up getting completely decimated. And they get it, Syria takes them out, and they get completely decimated. And actually, I want to show you that in 2 Kings chapter 17. So I'm jumping forward to 2 Kings. So I want you to remember this when we go through these kings, and it keeps saying the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. What is it talking about? It's talking about those two calves that he made that he said, these be thy gods, O Israel, that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. How dumb do you have to be? Like Jeroboam, really? It's either really ignorance, okay? It's really like you just don't know the law at all. You've never read the story. You've never read the story about them being in the wilderness and them making those golden calves, or you deliberately did exactly what they did in the wilderness to try to get Israel to rebel from the southern kingdom of Judah and from serving the Lord down in the tabernacle that he chose, in the place where he chose to put his name. And in 2 Kings chapter 17, we see the demise. So actually, when we go through 1 Kings, 1 and 2 Kings are more so focusing on Israel, the northern kingdom, okay? So you say, well, what's the difference between 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Chronicles? Well, 1 and 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles are pretty much parallel, okay? 1 Chronicles more so dealing with David and Saul and, even all the way back to Adam. But so 1 Chronicles, we're probably not going to be digging into that too much, as our study goes here. But 2 Chronicles is more so dealing with Judah, okay? And what you'll see is that once you get to 2 Kings chapter 17, Israel's gone. So then it's just straight up kings of Judah. You don't even have to worry about that whole, what king's reigning in this king. That's all done at that point. Now it's just Judah, and Israel's done. So 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 20, 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 20, it says, and the Lord rejected all the seed of Israel and afflicted them and delivered them into the hand of spoilers until he had cast them out of his sight. For he rent Israel from the house of David, and they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drave Israel from following the Lord and made them sin a great sin. See why it's important to know what we're talking about? What great sin did he make him sin? He made 2 calves and had them worship, and they would do a feast and all that stuff to them, to where what? That he drave Israel from following the Lord. Verse 22, for the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They departed not from them, until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had said by all his servants, the prophets. So was Israel carried away out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. And that's where Samaria comes from. The Samaritans, they were mingled with the Assyrians. And that's where that happens. But do you see how important it is to understand like what Jeroboam did? And how that just destroyed that whole kingdom. And they never left it. They kept going back to it. And trust me, we'll see all that, obviously, as far as all the kings that kept following that. And they'll even say, they did this right, but then they wouldn't depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And so going on in 1 Kings chapter 14, what we'll see is the judgment of Jeroboam for this. Is that, remember that God said, if you follow my commandments, if you do what I tell you to do, you'll have a sure house. So what's the opposite of that? He's going to kill every single one of his sons. And not only that, but all his sons are going to be eaten by animals, except for one. Okay. Remember, I was preaching this morning about about the determinate counsel of God and foreknowledge, and how sometimes young people will die, and it's for the better. This is the case. So in this story, and I'm not going to go through the whole story, but in 1 Kings chapter 14, you can go through this in your own time. The wife of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, comes to the prophet and wants to know, hey, my son, their child is sick, right? And they want to know, is the child going to live? And then the prophet is going to tell them what's happening here. And basically, the child's the only one that's going to be blessed in this. And he's actually going to die. That's the blessing. Okay? But in verse 10 here, it says, therefore, behold, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam him that pisseth against the wall, and him that is shut up and left in Israel, and will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam, as a man taketh away dung, till it be all gone. Him that dieth of Jeroboam in the city shall the dogs eat, and him that dieth in the field shall the fowls of the air eat, for the Lord hath spoken it. So he's saying that all your sons, and that's the way that God says that, okay? You say, well, is it the sons? It's him that pisses against the wall. That's how the Bible says it. You say, well, I can't believe you say that word. These are wholesome words. Every word of God is pure. He's a shield unto them that put their trust in him. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee, and thou be found a liar. The Bible is fine in saying that. And you know what? How much more does that need to be said today? Him that pisseth against the wall. People can't figure that out. That's how the Bible says who's a man. And so, there's a lot of countries now that won't even let you do that. You got to sit down and be a woman. But, in our society, we're dealing with the fact that they're just blurring the genders and all that. The Bible's very clear on this. I don't think anybody would discount who he's talking about here, right? He's talking about all the men. All his sons are going to die. But they're not only going to die, they're not going to go to the grave. They're going to be eaten by animals. By dogs. If they die in the city, a dog's going to eat them. And if they die in the field, the fowl of the air is going to eat them. They're not going to go to the grave. You think it's Jezebel? We'll get to Jezebel. But Jezebel is eaten by dogs, and the only thing that's left is her skull and the palms of her hands. That's not the way. Is that the way you want to go? Is that the burial you want to have? And you know what? The Bible can be crass because it says that her blood and everything would be in the field. You know what happened? The dogs ate her, and the dung of her was put out into the field. And you know what? That's the Bible. You need to get used to it, because the world has a different view on what the Bible is. The world has the Jeroboam, son of Nebat, view of the Bible. They're so backwards, they'd actually think that having 2 golden calves is Christian. And it's based off ignorance and just pure wickedness sometimes, where they're just purposely trying to be opposite of the Bible. But not with that child. So this is where, in verse 12 there, so the wife came there to inquire of the child. And she got more than what she bargained for as far as what she wanted to hear. But So all of them that piss against the wall, all the men are going to die and be eaten by animals. Verse 12, it says, Arise thou therefore, get thee to thine own house, and when thy feet enter into the city, the child shall die. And all Israel shall mourn for him and bury him, for he only of Jeroboam shall come to the grave, because in him there is found some good thing toward the Lord God of Israel in the house of Jeroboam. So, you know that verse in Isaiah 57 where it says that the righteous are cut off and no man taketh it to heart, that they're taken away for the evil to come? There you have it. There's an actual example in the Bible where that child was spared from the evil to come. Think about this. That child's probably in heaven, right? The child is in heaven, and all his brothers are all dead in hell probably. So who won out on that one? And so, yeah, I mean, when you're dealing with a wicked family, I'd rather that child grow up and get saved and live a righteous life for the Lord. But let's just be honest. In a lot of these cases, they're going to grow up and be as wicked as their father. And it's actually better for this child. And that's what the Bible says. This is a blessing that the child dies. Because he's actually mourned for. He's actually given a burial. And why? Because there was some good thing found in him of the Lord. And so, yeah, that seems a little rough, but, that's what the Bible teaches on that. But think about this too. Jeroboam, all his seed dies. Meaning they're not. What we'll see is that his son will reign for 2 years, and then he's going to be taken out. Okay? In Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, there's a lot of conspiracies and a lot of stabbing in the back. Okay, that's what we're going to see is that, this one king will reign, then his son will only reign for a little bit because he's going to be taken out. There's going to be conspiracy, and then that person will reign, then his son will reign for a little bit, and then he'll be taken out. And then you'll have like this whole chapter where kings are just killing each other, right? And you have Zimri and Omri and all this stuff, and then you're just like, man, everybody's just like stabbing each other in the back, and all this stuff's going on. And so there's going to be some really interesting stories going through actually the northern kingdom of Israel. Most of these people are evil, but it's still interesting, right? When people are burning houses down on themselves and doing all this stuff, there's some very interesting stories. But with Jeroboam, it all comes down to this. He feared the people, and he feared the future of what would happen to him. See, that sin that he sinned with making these two calves, why did he do it? Because he was afraid that the people would join themselves to Rehoboam, and then they would basically take his side and kill him. That's what he was afraid of. And it says, they shall kill me. That's the whole reason why he did that. He was just trying to keep everybody loyal to him and didn't want them coming in and out of Judah, and basically kind of like having a Absalom situation, where Absalom's kind of taking in their causes and he's kind of stealing their heart away. He was afraid of that. But here's the thing. Should you listen to your heart, or should you listen to God, who said that he will give you a sure house if you just follow him? And, just some verses on this. In Proverbs 21, verse 31, it says, the horse is prepared against the day of battle, but safety is of the Lord. Don't take this stuff into your own hands where you're just like, well, I'm going to do this, even if it's against the Bible. Listen, if your way of trying to take care of a situation is against what the Bible teaches, then you're not going to be blessed in that. You may think, well, this makes more sense. I'm going to actually be safer this way. No, you won't. Safety is of the Lord. I don't care how many guns you have. I don't care how strong you are. Nothing is going to give you safety like the Lord will give you safety. And I'm all for self-defense. I'm all for not being a weakling. I'm all for having guns and being armed and protecting my family if someone were trying to harm them. But ultimately, safety is of the Lord. Some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, or some trust in chariots, some trust in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. That's where my safety is. That's where my salvation's at. And Jeroboam, if he would have just took what God said to him and said, that's truth, he's going to perform that which he said he would do, then he wouldn't have made those golden calves, and that sin wouldn't have just destroyed that northern kingdom. I mean, decimated it. That whole northern kingdom was completely taken out because of that. And as we go through these kings, we'll see the kings that are going through, and what they do, but it always comes back that they're following the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and ultimately that's their demise. And so anyway, you should all know the name Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and we'll keep seeing that name being brought up as we go through the kings. But this is our first king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam. So then we'll get to his son, and so when you go through the northern kingdom, what you're going to find is they're not all like related, okay? Whereas with Judah, they're all the son of David going down the line of David, okay? And so, that's a big difference between the two. But let's end with the word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for today, and thank you for the souls that were saved. Thank you for the baptisms. And Lord, thank you for your word. I just pray that you would bless the time that we have a fellowship. And Lord, just thank you for these stories, and pray that they would apply in our lives, that we can use them